Good afternoon, everyone. It is 4 p.m. and the start of our British Chamber of Commerce webinar on supply chains. My name is Mark Rathbone. I'm a partner of PwC Singapore, and I'm the Asia Pacific leader for its capital projects and infrastructure team in the region, working with clients, both government and private sector, across large-scale delivery of big infrastructure programs. I am a member of the Transport and Logistics Committee for the British Chamber, and that has been set up to provide members across Singapore's business community with a forum really to discuss and get involved in transportation, logistics, and supply chain sectors, meeting new contacts, potentially understanding what's happening in the market, sharing information and know-how, as well as creating a channel to the Singapore government. The idea of these webinars is to give people an opportunity to understand more about their sector, and certainly the three speakers that you have today are experts in their fields, and hopefully you will find this very interesting. The subject of the webinar is the future outlook of supply chains, challenges, solutions, and impact on trade. Of course, COVID has really impacted on both individuals and corporates through the effect it's had on supply chain, whether it's due to an inability to purchase your overseas brands that you want, or more fundamentally, satisfying your need for components, raw materials, or equipment to deliver your businesses. During this webinar, our three guys will present their views on the economic and geopolitical landscape across the different parts of the supply chain and the effect that that's having on our region. And we'll give you a chance to have a good Q&A towards the end of it. There are a number of really interesting topics across this, whether it's RCEP, China-US trade wars, currencies, and the way that that's affecting trade at the moment. But indeed, certainly any client that I work with in the infrastructure space at present, supply chain is pretty key to that. Whether it's localizing supply chains or diversifying their suppliers to become more sustainable or resilient, it's top of mind to most of our clients that we work with. So without further ado, we will go into our first speaker for the afternoon, which is Max. Max Lin is a currency strategist at NatWest. He's based in Singapore, where he's responsible for writing macroeconomic research and commentary focusing on the Asian currencies. He frequently appears on CNBC and Bloomberg to share his views on the currency markets. Prior to joining NatWest, he was a currency strategist at a number of other investment banks. So, Max, over to you, if you would like to take over the screen and do your presentation. Oh, sorry, before you do, everyone, please do feel free to write questions that you may wish to ask in the Q&A tab. What we will do towards the end is I'll try and collate the more interesting ones and ask those of the panelists. Sorry, Max, over to you.
No problem. Thank you, Mark, for the introduction. So today I'm really going to focus my talk about exports and what that means for the outlook for Asian currencies. So we as a bank do expect the Asian currencies to continue appreciating versus the dollar. And that's because in some ways, although the pandemic has been very difficult for many economies globally, it actually has benefited North Asian export growth in a number of ways. We all know that in the US and in Europe, economies that have been hit particularly hard. But one sector that has been quite resilient amid lockdowns, and we're probably going to see this as the US goes through this third wave right now, is the fact that big tech companies in the US have actually been quite resilient. So the market narrative for these big tech companies has actually been that they benefited from the pandemic, with their dominance that they already had before the pandemic becoming more entrenched as people basically have to live through lockdowns. So even after a vaccine is rolled out, I do expect that these firms' dominance will continue and that their reliance on data analytics will continue. And that means that they will continue basically to build out data centers, which will result in their demand for things like Taiwanese microprocessors, for Korean memory chips, and for printed circuit boards created and assembled in China. So if I flip to my first slide here, so just from a GDP perspective, we do note that manufacturing and exports did take a hit, particularly in the second quarter of the year. But what I try to show in these complex charts, and I apologize if it's a little bit too much to digest at first, is that the actual hit to GDP that we saw in Asia, it's been very dispersed depending on lockdowns and how your governments here have been able to contain COVID. But that's been mostly on the services side. So the chart at the top left shows you the Q2 GDP year-on-year growth breakdown for select Asian economies. The dotted line is the total GDP growth year-on-year. And the bars are the various contributors to GDP, either manufacturing, construction, services, and agriculture. So in places like Taiwan, which probably handled COVID and the outbreak the best within Asia, GDP in Q2 was actually more or less flat, only shrank by 0.6% year on year. In Korea, similarly, you only saw a 3% decline in total GDP. Whereas in Singapore, although the Singapore government has managed to contain COVID since, we did have a difficult restricted lockdown period in the second quarter. And that did mean that GDP did fall by about 12% year on year. But you notice what's in common for all these economies is that although you have huge swings in things like construction, where in Thailand it was positive and it was negative 60% shrinking in Singapore, the real driver of GDP overall in the second quarter was services. Even for small open economies like Singapore, that's hugely reliant on trade, services still accounts for around 70% of total GDP. So when you had services in Singapore shrink by 13% year on year, that basically meant that GDP also shrank by 13% year on year, right? In places like Thailand, where you actually saw a positive growth in construction by around 8%, you still saw GDP shrink by 12% overall. That, again, that's because of services. So the scatter plot at the top right shows you services GDP growth year on year on the x-axis and total GDP growth on the y-axis. And you see a very strong relationship here. And again, that's true because even though we think of Asia as small open economies that are very reliant on trade, services is still the bulk of your GDP growth here. The charts at the bottom show you the similar data just for Q3. We saw Taiwan rebounded by 4% year on year. Korea was mostly flat, negative 1%. And Singapore did improve from negative 13 to negative 6% year on year growth. But again, here, the relationship with services is still quite strong. So although we did see hits to manufacturing in Q2, and we did see hits to trade, the real hit overall and the real hit to GDP growth has been from domestic services, things like restaurants, things like hotels, tourism, et cetera. That's really been the driver of GDP declines in Q2. From a trade perspective, it's actually been a little bit more stable. And we all think of Asia as being very linked to China, and that's true because Asia obviously is very geographically close to China. So there is this narrative in the market that, oh, well, because China is emerging from the recession, because China has been doing a good job of containing COVID, Asia will benefit because it trades with China. And that's actually not quite true when you think about it from a trade perspective. You just think about exports and year-on-year growth. So the chart at the left shows you exports to the US for Q2 and Q3, and we all know that the US had a very difficult time with COVID on the x-axis, versus the y-axis is export growth in Q2 and Q3 for China. So each dot is one country. So the dot at the right is Singapore and how much it traded to the US versus China in terms of growth. Malaysia, Philippines, Korea, et cetera. And you'll see that here for Singapore, even though Singapore has close geographical proximity to China, it's actually growing its exports more to the US than to China. And places like Philippines, which actually struggled with COVID in terms of its very severe lockdown in Q2 and Q3, you're actually seeing declines in both exports to China and the US. But overall here, the relationship isn't that strong. And if you think about the trend line as an average, you'll see that where the trend line intercepts the X and the Y intercepts, you only have an advantage of overall exports to China by about 4 to 8%. So it's not actually that strong. In my view, the real dispersion and export outperformance in Q2 and Q3 has been tech goods over non-tech goods. So the chart at the right shows you tech exports on the y-axis and non-tech exports on the x-axis. So for all these economies within Asia, Philippines, Thailand, Korea, Singapore, Malaysia, Taiwan, et cetera, their non-tech exports have been declining. Taiwan has performed the best, but it's still down by about 7% year on year. Whereas the tech exports are basically outperforming for all these categories. Taiwan's tech exports are growing by 20%, Singapore's by 10%, Malaysia's by 8%, and Korea is about flat in Q2 and Q3. And if you actually look at the trend line here, the relationship is actually quite strong. And if you pay attention to the X and the Y intercepts, the Y intercept here is 40%, and the X intercept is 15%. So you're actually seeing a huge export outperformance. Even if you have tech exports growing at 0, that does mean that it's still outperforming your non-tech exports by about 15%. And if you have non-tech exports growing at 0%, this model, if you assume that's some simplified model, means that your tech exports should be growing by about 40% year on year. So very, very strong overall. Now, the next three charts will basically just show the export portfolios overall. And here, this is the export growth from China, and this is for October. This is the most recent data by category. Plastics overall has been growing by 98% year on year. That's because of global PP&E demand. But if you put that aside, you'll see other strong categories such as data processing, data storage, things like computers, things like hard drives, as people have to telecommute from home. That's been growing quite strongly. Integrated circuits are also growing by 14% year on year. If we go to the next economy, which is Taiwan. Here, Taiwan, you'll see huge outperformance because half of Taiwan's exports are electronics and commercial and information equipment, or sorry, information and communications equipment. And those categories have been growing by about 20% year on year. So total exports in Taiwan are growing by about 11%, and that's because half of the basket here is technology goods, and that's been growing by 20% year on year. So again, very strong, even though you have the pandemic basically ravaging economies globally. Now, this slide is a similar chart for Korea. You'll see that all the export outperformance here is in things like displays, things like wireless and telecommunications equipment, and things like semiconductors. Because again, as these big tech companies have to continue relying on the data and have to build out their data analytics capacity, they have to keep on importing things like Korean memory chips. So overall, that does point to demand for electronic goods made in Asia, which should point to appreciation for their currencies. So this chart on slide 7, this is basically similar data except for time series. So this is for North Asian economies. The charts on the left show you exports to the US versus exports to China. And where you see the yellow shaded region going positive, that means that exports to China are growing faster than exports to the US. So for Korea, which are the charts at the top, you'll see that there was a bump in Chinese export growth in Q2, but that quickly faded out. And now Korea's actually shipping more to the US than they are to China in terms of overall growth. The real bump overall, however, is the technology goods. So the green shaded area shows you where semiconductor growth is beating non-semiconductor growth. And that delta is about 15% to 30% year on year. The charts at the bottom show you similar data except for Taiwan. You don't really see a bump in exports to Taiwan or exports from Taiwan to China versus exports from Taiwan to the US. Where you do see a huge bump, however, is the chart at the bottom right. In Q2 and Q1, you saw exports in technology goods basically beating overall export growth by about 30% year on year. And that's a huge delta. And because Asia is so dominant within the tech supply chain, again, that's why we think that Asian currencies have further scope to appreciate. So this is similar charts, except for Singapore at the top and Malaysia at the bottom. Again, you're not really seeing a strong lasting bump in export growth to China, even though China is doing quite well post-pandemic. You're seeing the real bump in outperformance of the technology goods. So overall, because the export outlook means that for Asia will be quite strong, you are seeing some of these currencies appreciate. They've already moved a lot this past year. Korea and China particularly having some of the best performing currencies in Asia. So people are always concerned that Asia, which has historically been accused of being a currency manipulator, might slow the appreciation of these currencies. But I actually think that probability is quite low, simply because as long as the exporters are doing well, the Asian central banks will basically stand by and allow their currencies to slowly appreciate. So as long as this outlook is strong, I do expect continued outperformance in the Korean won, the Chinese RMB, and the Taiwan dollar. And with that, I'll pass it back to Mark Rathbone. Thank you for your time.
Mark, you're on mute.
Thank you, Sabina. I've been warned to watch the mute button. Max, thank you. That was excellent. It was very detailed and a huge amount of data to get your head around there. I'd love to spend more time trying to understand it, but maybe we can do that during the Q&A. So our next speaker is going to be Jonathan Worf. He's the global head of procurement for Essentra. He started his career managing factories in Africa and then moved into procurement after completing his MBA. Since then, he's worked for a number of organizations across the supply chain, Vodafone, PwC, Heineken, Mars, Royal Mail, and he's now the Chief Procurement Officer for Essentra. So, Jono, over to you. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Mark. Just a little bit about Essentra, because I describe it as the largest organization people have never heard of. It's a FTSE 250 organization. It has a presence actually in 34 countries. This slide is slightly out of date because we are an acquisition company. We actually have 70 facilities, but 48 manufacturing sites. And we manufacture or resell 3 very distinct groups of products. And this is where my supply chain challenge becomes very complicated, in that the first division is plastic components. So we provide components from everything to medical products to cars. We then do pharmaceutical packaging, which is a very specific product. And then we have cigarette filters. So a very varied business, which really does sit across the globe. So when I was asked to join this, sorry, there we go, next one. Now, what are the challenges? What can I talk about for 2020? Well, the first thing to think about is obviously the pandemic, but actually this year has been far more turbulent than just the pandemic. So you can see from this chart that the tariff wars the trade wars between China and the US have escalated over the last 2 years and ramped up significantly. That's had a huge impact on our supply chain. We've then got Brexit. As we speak today, we don't know in UK whether or not we're going to have a trade deal with Europe. And we had a bit of a trial run last year, but actually, what's the impact going to be? We just don't know. This uncertainty has huge impact on whether we should increase stock in the UK or Europe, whether we should think about our logistics suppliers. Huge amount of uncertainty. We then have the pro-democracy movement in China. It's in Hong Kong. It has been a destabilizing, worrying element. We then have the US election. For a long period of time, we just did not know which way it was going to go. If it was going to go Trump, there'd be a very right-wing view to world economy. Got Biden, a different approach. Again, all very big challenges for us to try and predict, and we didn't know right up until the end. We then have the Black Lives Matter movement. This is really significant. The world is waking up to economic and social disparity, and we're recognizing that we need to bring this back in line. It's a significant movement which I think will continue to impact us, quite rightly so. And then we have the pandemic. I did this slide about 2 weeks ago. Unfortunately, these numbers have significantly gone up since then. So what I'm trying to show is it's been a very, very difficult year. I know we all know that, but it's significant. Uncertainty. Uncertainty is a huge challenge in supply chains. We are a global world. We have global supply chains moving things from China to America and America to China, from Europe to Africa. It is difficult to do that when we have uncertainty. So what's the impact on 2021 for me, from what I can see, and what I'm preparing for? Well, it's going to be just as uncertain and messy, unfortunately. Yes, we've got the vaccine. Yes, there's light at the end of the tunnel. But a lot of the geopolitical issues are still going to be there. A lot of the social unrest is still going to be there. Companies are also going to be scarred. They're going to be scarred from the last year. There are going to be some companies that have run down their stock. There's going to be some companies that have wound down their manufacturing sites. There's going to be a lot of companies that have tried to survive over the last year. And when the economy and demand comes back on, we're going to have a challenge. And there's a potential for, I think, a potential supply chain shock in 2021. We also have the continued retrenchment of manufacturing from China. I think this is an interesting point because, yes, the pandemic has brought the spotlight on the fragility of the supply chain from China to the West, so to speak. But in reality, this has been something that supply chain managers that I've talked to myself for a long time have been looking at. The geopolitical position has become more unstable. We just need to think about what's happened in the last week with China and Australia in the wine and so forth. This uncertainty and this instability is really unnerving for us. How do we plan? How do we, if we are expecting to ship products to China and all of a sudden there's a 20% tariff put on it, there's a real challenge to us there. Is the market actually there for us? You also have the fact that China is actually starting to boom. It has recovered very well from COVID. It is booming. We have Centra has manufacturing sites in China, and we are booming. We're doing very well there. We are struggling to deliver for our China customers, let alone exporting out of China. So that's pushing prices up in China. So should we actually be moving away from China anyway? Should we be moving to other potential low-cost countries like Romania, India? It's all questions that we need to think about. So I talked earlier about this supply chain shock. I think that's something that we really need to think about in the coming year. They were potentially zombie companies. I'm interested in Max's view on this. Zombie companies in Europe that had high levels of debt. Yes, debt is cheap at the moment, but in the UK, we've just seen a large retail company called Arcadia go under because they haven't been able to service the debt that they have with the downturn. So I think it's going to be potential for challenges there. And that would potentially lead into inflation. Are we going to see inflation coming through? I've talked to a number of people about this, and some people are saying, no, it's not going to happen. Some people are saying it's going to happen, but I think it's something that we do need to be mindful of, that we have for so long accepted that prices are going to go down. And much of that has been on the back of low cost products coming from the East. Are we going to see a shift? Are we going to start seeing inflation? There's a lot of money floating around, and how's that going to knock on to our customers? So the increase in driving social and economic, I talked about Black Lives Matter. I really do think this is again going to have an impact in next year. Where this is going to be on supply chain, I'm not sure, but it's certainly going to be an impact for us. And increase in environmental awareness. As I sit in the UK, I can look out of my window and I can see a lot further. The environmental impact has become very real for us, and I think that's going to drive through to consumers as well. So what can we learn from 2020 into 2021? Well, we need to prepare for uncertainty. In supply chain, how do we do that? It's very difficult. Digitization helps. If we have that data, if we have access to data, it's a lot easier to make decisions. It's a lot easier to try and navigate the consumer habits. It's a lot easier to navigate what's happening with the transport industry. At the moment, we have a challenge with containers in America, where we actually need containers in the East at the moment to move things back over to America. So digitization will help us to do this. Digitization will help us to understand what our stock volumes are and how we should be holding things. The increase in acceleration on environmental, we have to do this. The UK government has committed huge amounts to this. We are going to see this, and I think we're going to see it led by the consumers. Now, the focus on people and leaders. I think this is probably the biggest impact that we need to do over, which I've learned from 2020. So, sorry. So, if I look back, what's helped me succeed in 2020, we have 70-odd facilities, and none of those facilities have actually run dry, have not been able to deliver or produce over the last year. That has happened because we've had people in place. The world has been changing so quickly that we've had people in place that have been able to make decisions, they've been able to engage with other people, they've been able to talk to suppliers. The people and the leaders have been the people that have been the difference for me, that has able to allowed us to maintain our supply chain. So if I had one thing to focus on, it would be the people. It would be get the people right in the organization. The data is great. It allows you to make decisions I've talked about, but it's people and relationships that keep us running. In the last year, I've not opened one contract. I've not had to take one contract to a supplier to force people to deliver. We've maintained supply because we've had relationships with people, we've had good relationships with companies. That is the difference for this year. We've been able to have the diversity, and this is again going on about diversity. We have a very diverse team in Accenture, and what that's meant is across all of the countries, when we have had challenges, if we've had challenges in India, if we've had challenges in China, we've had local people, excuse me, we've had local people that have been able to work with the government, work with suppliers in order to solve solutions. Yes, the data has helped us to make those decisions, but it's the people that have really made the difference. And in this world with such uncertainty, it's the culture and the people that have allowed us to succeed. So my one thing for 2021 is people make the difference. We are in very uncertain times, but it is going to be people that will allow us to succeed. And it is going to be the culture of the organization that will make the difference between those that succeed and those that can deliver on their supply chain. So Mark, thank you very much. Over to you.
Thanks, Jono. I think that was excellent. It's a nice way to finish a presentation with focus on people and the importance of diversity, especially when we talk about SDGs and sustainability and representation and leadership of people from diverse backgrounds. Right, our next speaker is Mark Phillip. Mark is PwC's management consulting leader across ASEAN and is a specialist in supply chain and digital transformation and implementation. So without further ado, Mark, if you want to take ownership of the screen, and it's all yours.
Perfect, thank you. Hope you can see my screen. Can you see the screen?
Yeah, we see the screen.
Okay, perfect. Thanks, everyone. I mean, as we've spoken a bit around, there's obviously a lot of things that are happening through the pandemic and are happening through the Chinese-US trade wars and so on. And a couple of things that we're seeing is and I think one of the questions came up earlier, we're seeing a clear strategy towards China plus one for many of our clients. So what that means really is that China produces for China, and the product is being sold in China. And then we're seeing, at least in Southeast Asia, we're seeing quite a significant FDI inflow into Vietnam, because I think that was one of the questions. So we're seeing probably Vietnam, to some extent, Thailand is probably the two big markets, depending again on the industry that our clients operate in, where we're seeing build up of that manufacturing capacity for Southeast Asia. But rather than talking about some of the macro economic and pandemic issues that we're seeing, I just quickly wanted to talk about some of the questions that we see in the supply chain, maybe sort of give it more of a digital spin on what some of the companies that are doing. Jono was just talking a bit around the digitalization, acceleration of that is obviously critical. So if we look at even in a pre-COVID world, especially through the Chinese-US trade wars and all of the changes in consumer behavior, changes in obviously globalization, there's a lot of questions that are being asked consistently on supply chain leaders. That could be from, obviously, one of the big themes has been we used to consolidate a lot of our suppliers. Now through COVID very rapidly and through Chinese-US trade wars, we're seeing, hey, are we dual sourcing? How do we balance some of those issues around where product is coming from? Also, actually, do we really understand our suppliers? So we found that many of our clients don't really have a full understanding of the financial or operational health of their suppliers through China plus one, as I just touched on. Also, we're finding that many of our clients are struggling around how will all of those changes in the way we manufacture or the way we supply, how does actually impact our supply chain? How does it have to change the way that we need to plan all the way through? And I think many of our clients were hit quite hard through COVID. They didn't have full visibility of the inventory. And one thing we're also seeing is that Southeast Asia or Asia particularly is very different to Europe and the US, where you have a lot more visibility through the supply chain, but through the different tiering that we see, many of our clients are really struggling to understand where's a lot of the inventory, and how do you know how much more do you push into the channel. Obviously, a lot of issues around demand planning. I think no surprise. And then a big theme that we've talked through for quite a while, but we're seeing a lot of acceleration is this entire e-commerce topic, especially if you're sort of a consumer products type business that traditionally has gone through a retailer model, but now we're seeing a significant shift more to e-commerce. And then many of our clients, we realized, are struggling with this entire, how do we now deal with e-commerce? Is it just omni-channel? Do we need a very different ordering approach to fulfill customer needs and value propositions? Do we need to change the distribution strategy? Do we need to change the way we plan? And so on, so on. So there's many questions that have been there for a while, but I think that have just been accelerated through obviously the last few months as we were all working through pandemic. Interestingly, during that time, and I wanted to share a few snippets from this, during the December to April period, PwC has done a global survey of about 1,600 companies across the globe, and the question overarchingly was around what will the 2025 supply chain look like? What are you investing in? And obviously that became an interesting COVID element to that as well. But there's 4 winning capabilities that we see, and I think Jonathan, some of these things you touched on a bit around. First of all, how do we really invest in getting proper supply chain transparency? And I'll touch on in a second, but not just seeing our supply chain, but having end-to-end visibility into our suppliers, into our distributors, and into our customers. Second thing is very much around how can we get a much faster technology-enabled closed-loop integrated planning, like demand planning, demand sensing, demand forecasting, for us to have a much more robust planning processes. Smart logistics, obviously very critical, as we're seeing disruptions to the flows, be that the shipment flows, the air flows, and also sort of road, rail, multimodal flows within the countries, and then also warehousing. Obviously, we're seeing quite a lot of capabilities there. And the last one, I think, as I touched on around how do we manage our supply chains in a very dynamic way that enable us to better respond to certain peaks and drops, and how do we drive more e-commerce? So that's sort of the 4 key areas that we're seeing many of these companies that we interviewed investing in terms of digitalization of those supply chains. No big surprise, a big enabler is AI and a lot of data analytics. And we've done quite a lot of work in the region, even in Philippines and Indonesia, where on base value, you would say there's not that much data. We've never found data to be the big issue. We found it more around how to really connect all of the data to have the true visibility. And as I think Jonathan said a bit earlier, no big surprises. What does it mean? How does the supply chain organization have to change? How do we drive better collaboration across different functions? How do we uplift capability, especially in those areas? And most importantly, how do we shift some of the mindset in the leadership? So maybe a takeaway around 4 winning capabilities and a few enablers and to make it happen. Just to give you a sense on visibility, so we've seen quite a significant investment, and what you see here is sort of 3 maturity levels: working in silos, achieving functional efficiency, which basically means that you're integrated within your company, within the elements of the company, and then all the way to external integration and end-to-end orchestration. So the darker red is the digital champions. So 81% of what we would consider digital champions across the globe have invested already in end-to-end orchestration, in external integration, where 62 of more the digital novices would sit in the achieving functional efficiencies. Maybe just gives you a bit of a sense around what significant shift there is between a digital champion and sort of the other companies that we would see currently in the market. Also, the good thing is of that 81%, 75 have invested in existing technology. So it's not something that is sort of a bit new or that hasn't been tried. There is existing technology and software in the market that enabled some of the integration and orchestration. To give you also a bit of a sense in the companies that have invested in becoming more digitally enabled on the top line, so the digital champions would have seen about 2 times the return of investment within 1 year, and sort of the revenue, not the ROI, but the revenue uplift through digital supply chain capabilities. And they also have seen double the cost savings versus companies that are more digital novices from a maturity perspective and haven't significantly invested it. The typical ROI that we see on some of these investments is about 1.2 years. So again, as we spoke a bit around capability uplift to drive more resilience, but we're also seeing quite a significant uplift in revenue enabled through supply chain capability, and we're seeing quite a significant reduction in cost enabled through investments in supply chain. Give you a bit of that sense. Just to finish off, to maybe give you a bit more of an extreme version of an end-to-end orchestration. Some of you might have heard last week and over the last 2 weeks when the Deputy Prime Minister of Singapore announced the Emerging Stronger Task Force, which is driven by the Singapore Together Alliance for Action, which is basically an alliance of over 50 government entities and corporates, be that the big multinationals like Exxon, DBS, Standard Chartered, SATS, and many others, and also some of the local larger businesses and the small and medium-sized businesses. We've been quite lucky to work with the Alliance for the last 3 months and are continue working. So what really Singapore did, for those who are not aware, Singapore mapped out all of the key supply chain flows across all of the elements of supply chain. So in oil and gas, that would be from ExxonMobil initiating an order down to the agent, to the bank who's financing it, to the shipping companies, the hauliers, down to the oil storage and the export markets with customs and port and all of the relevant stakeholders in order to identify over 60 pain points. So the largest, getting people together jointly to look at pain points. And they've just launched at the press conference and what we're building now, which is a common data infrastructure. So the vision is that Singapore and GovTech will run this. Singapore will enable a full data sharing between the different participants in all of the supply chains in Singapore, in order to obviously get rid of some of the inefficiencies, but also it should enable faster and lower cost funding from some of the banks because they have better visibility of the risk profiles. It should enable also that's not as much paper being pushed around anymore. So we have much more interoperability between the different systems and should drive a lot of high adoption. And ultimately, why Singapore is doing this is there's a very strong view that in the next few years, Singapore won't be competitive anymore as a trading hub. And trade flow Singapore is 3 times GDP, so the only country in the world where it's that high. So having this common data infrastructure or end-to-end supply chain orchestration or connectivity should hopefully enable Singapore to continue being competitive into the future. So hopefully they gave you a bit of a sense around of some of the questions supply chain is asking themselves, what are they investing in the capabilities? And then even countries now like Singapore are now taking a stance around how do we really drive full supply chain orchestration in order to benefit all of the various stakeholders along the supply chain. Thank you, Mark.
Mark, that was excellent. Thank you very much. Well, those are 3 extremely rich presentations that we've had. Maybe before I go to the attendees for questions, I've got probably a question for each of you that really jumped to mind, and maybe starting with Max. I mean, there's 2 parts to this. One is the recent trade conflict between the US and China and the effect that's had on trade globally. So the question is, do you see the Biden administration changing that? But then related to that question is RCEP. And of course, that's a very comprehensive free trade deal across Asia. And I'm quite interested to know how you think that will impact on Asian supply chains in the medium term, and whether or not you see the US ever joining that. So Max.
Sure. Thank you, Mark. So it is quite interesting. It is quite interesting that you do mention the Biden administration, because I do think that Biden will probably maintain actually some of the phase 1 and the tariff tariff restrictions on Chinese trade. I think even though Trump was not able to get himself reelected, I think he did transform U.S. politics in that being tough on China from a trade perspective is now basically the bipartisan consensus in Washington, D.C. And I think where it will change the relationship is that for Trump, he sort of viewed his relationship with China as very transactional. I think he tended to overlook things like human rights issues that the U.S. historically looked at, whether it was in Hong Kong, whether it was in Xinjiang. And he basically was happy with China as long as China was buying soybeans or other U.S. farm and manufacturing goods from the U.S. So he always looked at it as, okay, as long as you buy this, I'll let this happen. Whereas Biden is going to take a more multilateral approach relative to Trump, and is going to basically try to get allies like Australia, Germany, NATO allies, et cetera, to basically try to get China to curb either abuses on intellectual property, abuses with how the private sector interacts with the military. And we already started to see some of that pushback happening against China. And that takes me into the RCEP. So it is true that the US did leave the TPP in 2017, right after Trump was elected. And RCEP basically has sort of filled the vacuum, or so the narrative says, that China is now basically becoming the world leader in globalization. But if you actually look at the terms of the RCEP in terms of intellectual property, it's not really as aggressive as the TPP was. So the big advantage for RCEP is that it has scale. It is the largest trade deal ever recorded because it does include China. So that basically includes 2.2 billion people total and nominal GDP of 26 trillion total for member countries. But if you actually look at the terms on trade or on SOE subsidies, it's actually not that groundbreaking. So where it will facilitate trade eventually within Asia is it'll have low value manufacturing trade like things like milk, rice, et cetera, within Asia. So over time, and the tariff reductions are gradual, countries like Japan, Australia, New Zealand, ASEAN, they will benefit from trade with one another. But in terms of the actual high-tech supply chain, things like semiconductors, things like printed circuit boards, things that are higher value add, those tariffs were already zero to begin with because Asia understands that we're not really trying to protect our semiconductor industry. We need to trade with others in order to specialize. So I do think that RCEP will boost trade in the lower end of the manufacturing chain. But the higher end of the manufacturing chain will mostly just continue as it was without the RCEP.
Okay. That's really good. Excellent. So maybe just changing tack slightly here and going back to Jonathan. You talked about people a lot, and certainly most of our organizations over the course of the last few years have been looking at diversity across our employment base and leadership. Very, very importantly. So the first part is, can you give us an example of how people have really made a difference in how you manage your supply chain? And secondly, then, how is diversity helping deliver a more effective supply chain as part of that?
Thanks, Mark. It's a good question. So in March, when the pandemic really hit the UK and the world, it came as a wave across Asia and into the West. Our CEO was great, and the first thing that he came out and was very clear in his communication is that our people's safety was a priority, and that would be at no expense. And as a consequence, as the entire world tried to source protective PPE, I was tasked with doing that for 70-odd facilities in 34 countries. And I've never bought PPE before, not at that scale and that level. So how do you do that? Well, we also work with a customer, Johnson & Johnson, who are a pharmaceutical company. So it was by talking to our salespeople. So again, this is where procurement and logistics being an organization, and I pride myself on a centre being an organization where we are linked into the business. So we linked into the business and talked to our salespeople and said, who buys this stuff? Who can we talk to? And through a contact with Johnson & Johnson, we were put in touch with a manufacturer in China, because there was no way in Europe or even America, we just couldn't buy this stuff directly. We had through a supplier, we had to buy it directly. We actually had to purchase manufacturing space in China in order to get enough significant stock. And so it was through people and through our relationships that we got contact with a supplier that we'd never dealt with. Now, that was a significant multi-million-pound deal that we had to use relationships. Contracts were pointless. Time wasn't in place to put contracts in place, so we had to use people. And then we get to the next slide that it was actually in China, and this is to my point about diversity. And there was a recent thing in the last week where a film put some comments in that was actually insulting to the Chinese populace, and therefore they've actually lost the ability to roll out a multi-million-pound film in China. And that's because culturally they didn't have the insight. Now, the reason I'm saying that is we've put a massive order in place in a manufacturing site in China, which is great. We've got the manufacturing, we've got this ordered. How do we get it out of China? The docks have closed, planes aren't flying anymore, and also the trade war, the trade tariffs were actually still going on between China and the US, to the point where China at some point was stopping pharmaceutical goods leaving China. It was through people. It was our manufacturing people in China. It was the fact that we have local Chinese people in the supply chain that allowed us to understand what was the real driver behind the government in China putting restrictions on the exportation. It was the local people, that local resource allowed us to actually get hold of air freight. So that to me is a very real example of where if we didn't have the diverse organization, if we didn't have the links with our salespeople, if we didn't have the different cultural mix within our organization, we would not have been able to make sure that our factories were safe and able to continue to produce during this pandemic.
That's a really nice story. I'm going to try and remember that and plagiarize it when I talk to clients. All right, Mark, just changing it a little bit. We've talked about RCEP, the China-US trade war. We've got some great insights there around people. In terms of ASEAN and Singapore specifically, how do you see our markets benefiting in the longer run as a result of the current political situations in the pandemic?
Yeah, I think it's again a really interesting question, and it would be great if so I just have a bit of a lag. I just could still see you talking. so it's a really interesting question, and obviously it would be nice to have the 8-ball to look into, our crystal ball to look into. I think one thing we're seeing quite a lot right now already is we're seeing, especially what's happening in Hong Kong, I think is an opportunity, but obviously Singaporean government would treat it quite lightly. But we're supporting generally a lot of clients set up multinational supply chain and procurement hubs in Singapore, traditionally what many companies, multinationals have. So we're seeing quite a lot of companies, especially US companies, who traditionally would have headquartered their Asia Pac or parts of their Asia Pac in Hong Kong, looking at moving to Singapore. So almost a lot of them. Two drivers for that. One, there's obviously the uncertainty about this whole China-US component. And secondly, there's also obviously the entire security issue, and also many people nervous about the children going to school and the type of things that are happening in Hong Kong as part of that, of some of the issues they're having. So I think one opportunity is potentially more headquarters moving to Singapore. Also, Singapore is nicely balanced between China and India, as we're seeing India growing as well. That's one part. Secondly, I think we think there is a potentially on the back of especially COVID, there are obviously Singapore is trying to become more of a biotech hub. Obviously, we know it's trying to become more of a sort of food engineering, future foods hub. We also know obviously it's looking towards potentially becoming a contract manufacturing hub for the vaccine across the region. So as Pfizer's and many companies are looking to have regional hub and contract manufacturing, Singapore, obviously with quality standards and just the location it has as a global hub, could potentially become sort of part of that hub for certain higher value industries from a manufacturing perspective as well. So it's a mix of headquarter and potentially some selected manufacturing or investment areas when it comes to unicorns and so on. As there are all kinds of issues and restrictions, as we know with China, and if you're a unicorn, and we see with TikTok in the US, right, there's all kinds of potential issues associated with that provides opportunity for potentially for Singapore.
I think that's very helpful. That's very helpful. So just moving on from that, and this is a question back to you again. I'm going to open this up to the floor. We've got 3 questions that have come through. You partially answered the first one, which was around markets that are really adopting the China +1 strategy effectively, or offering good viability as a good viable alternative. Are there any more outside of Vietnam, and why are those countries good options or viable options?
I mean, it means 2 things, and it would be interesting to get some others' perspective. I mean, it really depends on the industry, to be honest, right? So we're obviously seeing a lot of historically, a lot of electronics has been made in Taiwan, right? We're seeing a lot of food and fresh produce agriculture often move into Thailand. We've seen a lot of textiles, so really where you have really low cost. So if your primary driver is low cost, low labor, I think we'll see more of Laos, Cambodia, Myanmar, especially, because we see quite a lot of investment in Myanmar. Again, it has political issues, but we're seeing quite a lot of investment in Myanmar. So it really depends on the industry that you play in, and it really depends on what's driving the investment. Is this low cost of labor, then you would go into sort of the Laos, Cambodia, Myanmar. If it's sort of access to a lot of produce, as we know, Philippines and Thailand. If it's access to a large population, we see quite a bit in Indonesia, but that's manufactured for Indonesia. So it really depends a bit on the industry that you're in, sector you're in. But we're also seeing actually, when we talk to our US colleagues, we're seeing quite a significant shift of Chinese production for the US market into Guatemala, Mexico. So this sort of Central America is really emerging as a potential hub for manufacturing for North America. So we're seeing quite a bit of shifts into those markets as well.
So I'd agree with Mark there. It's a very complicated. The question is, the answer is far more complicated than the question, because it's not just about cheap labor. It's about your supply chain after the product has been actually produced. Do you need to be close to the customer? Do you need to be close to that kind of final mile? What is the size? What's the bulk? What's the weight? How easy do you have access to actually distributing the product after it's been produced, as well as the actual cost of producing it? And then how close you are actually to the raw materials that you need. So what's the key drivers? And then the other side of this is the environmental side. I think we're going to see consumers driving, having an impact on where we need to manufacture these products. Because if you think about foodstuffs, Kenya is a large producer of foodstuffs to Europe, but it's all flown in. Are we going to get a kickback from the environmental side of that? I think that's going to be an influencer. So it's a really difficult question to answer. I think it's just lots of different elements.
I guess there's a fair amount of the whole term localization, which has been bandied around supply chain more recently. So I guess the point you're making is that's both in terms of getting your product, your components and raw materials that go into the manufacturing process, but then also being close to the consumer so that you can get them to the consumer.
And the other point, sorry, Mark, lag there, but the other point is, does the consumer require it to be closer? Are the consumer actually going to start pushing for things to be produced closer to where they are actually consuming those products? I think that's still an unknown, but I suspect we're going to see a consumer drive where people are buying products that are produced closer to them than in the past.
So that goes into very nicely a question from Diana Reeves. So what do you guys see supply chain corporates doing with regards to SDG? given their ability to move at speed and influence and reach engage last mile populations. So I guess that's partially what you're getting to there on the consumer.
I think in 2021, 2022, the corporates are going to need to rethink. They've been in survival mode. They've all been in survival mode for the last year. Going into 21, 22, it's how do we grow? How do we change and benefit from this? So I think organizations are going to start asking a lot of these questions. Now, Singapore is well placed to influence a number of markets within Asia. So I would expect to see people investing more in Singapore because of its geographical position, but also its stable political position.
Okay. And for all of you guys, the broader sustainability and SDG focus, where do you see that really being impacted most for supply chain? I mean, is it in the shipping market, or is it in decarbonization of production, going to net zero? I mean, how does that work? To any of you three.
Yeah, that's a big question. A really big question. I think it's going to affect all of these things. You know, one of the largest producers of CO2 is actually shipping. You know, those big diesel engines, and I think a lot of this will be driven from the consumer. I'm expecting there to be a drive from the consumer, having been locked up, having been under this lockdown. The environment is becoming real to us. You know, the reality is this pandemic is driven from the fact that we're all so interlinked, and we're physically seeing the impact to the environment, but we're also seeing the impact of geopolitics to people's lives. We're seeing riots in different countries. I think the consumer are really going to drive a lot of this, and as a consequence, we'll see suppliers doing the same.
Yeah. Well, that leads us to our final question, which is a nice way to finish, as we have 3 minutes left. And if I can have a sound bite from each of you as an answer for this. It's a good question. So the pandemic has been an instant global event, affecting all of us pretty much simultaneously, both at a personal level and corporate level. Does the panel think that recovery will be as global an event, or will there be leaders and followers? And where do we think APAC will be in that recovery? So, Jonathan, as you're on the screen and I'm looking at you, why don't you go first, and then we'll go to Max and then Mark.
So I'm the optimist, but as Mark said, it'd be great to have a crystal ball because we make a lot of money. But I'm absolutely optimist. I think there will be a recovery. But I think they will be leaders and chasers, as you said, Mark. So, but yeah, we'll see an upturn, but people are doing at different paces.
Okay, Max, your views?
Sure, I do think it will be a global event, and I do think Asia is actually already leading this recovery quite strongly. Just being in Singapore, when you do walk around here, although everyone does wear masks, it almost feels like things are more or less back to normal. Restaurants are open, shopping malls are open, retail is readily available. So I do think that from that perspective, Asia already is a leader, and we're already seeing that in places like Taiwan and Korea. They're going through a third wave, but it is much more subdued than what we're seeing in the US and Europe. Where the US and Europe have this sort of advantage in the recovery is the scale of the recovery is because things were hit so hard in 2020. I do think that the bounce back will be very strong in the US and Europe, just naturally because of the V-shaped recovery, right? So although I think the V in Asia is coming earlier, it's not as deep as you're seeing in the US and Europe. So it's a bit of positive and negative for Asia and the rest of the world.
Great. Mark?
Yeah, I mean, again, would be nice to have a crystal ball, right? But I agree. My only view on it is I think we're seeing, at least in Southeast Asia, potential different paths. So Indonesia obviously is struggling a lot more. Philippines is struggling a lot more, whereas Singapore, Thailand, Vietnam, Malaysia, to some extent, are currently going better. So I think it might not be that all of Southeast Asia will be in the same sort of recovery, I think there will potentially be two speeds and two different cycles of recovery. Hopefully it's all fast, but I think there might be some troughs still to go through in some of these countries.
Brilliant. Well, guys, listen, I've thoroughly enjoyed that, and I've learned a tremendous amount about supply chain, so that's great. I'm going to hand back to Sabina now, or not hand back, but there are contact details. Hopefully you found that useful. What would be fantastic is if you could fill out a survey, a feedback survey that will be sent to you by email. And also please note the next webinar that will be held. So what do consumers expect from brands, which is coming up. So it is now 5 o'clock. I would like to thank all of you for your attention and thoroughly thank the speakers. That was excellent. Thanks for taking your time, and Sabina for organizing this, and to the British Chamber of Commerce for, again, putting on a great event that we can all learn from. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you all.